Welcome back to the Communication Mastery Podcast with me, Mark Berlinson, where we unleash the power of understanding to build bridges and not boxes. That's because we understand that communication is the soil in which teamwork grows. And this is episode 11. We had a great conversation with Debbie Connor in the last episode, and I found that so inspiring. And a couple of things that came up really got me thinking about what to look at in this episode. And I want to talk a little bit about bridging cultures, because all of us have to handle different settings and different cultures. Maybe it's generations. In my case, it was continents. I moved from the UK to North America about 25 years ago. Then I moved from Canada to South Carolina. And each time I've had to bridge between cultures. And effective communication, whether it's across different demographics or different cultures, requires us to look at several different elements and to hold them in tension in our communication. And so I've got 6 key elements for you to focus on, and then some practical suggestions with each of those. The first thing to focus on, if you know you're bridging between different cultures, is cultural awareness. It's important to understand the cultural backgrounds, the values, the norms of the individuals that you're involved with in that communication. Give you an example of that. I have a great friend here in the Myrtle Beach area who's an African American lady who was born and raised here, so she's totally different from me. But she's been able to educate me on some of the challenges that the African American community face, some of the tensions that there are between the communities, so that I can understand far more clearly what the challenges would be in our communication. She and I get along really well, partly because she understands communication at a deep level as well. But she's been able to introduce me to things that would never have crossed my mind. Things like the fact that her son, who's the most amazing guy, lovely young man, he gets followed in every store he goes into because he's a tall African-American male. And there's an assumption in the stores that he's going to be the one who's shoplifting, whereas that would be the furthest from his mind. I know the guy, he's a great friend. But when you research and when you learn about the cultures that you want to connect with, the cultures you're interacting with, then you're able to begin to recognize and accommodate the differences in communication styles, the differences in traditions, even the differences in gestures. I have a friend who's of Italian heritage and keeps doing this all the time. And in some settings, that can be very offensive. But she's learned to be careful in some settings not to gesture in her Italian way so that she doesn't cause unnecessary offense. The second area that helps us to bridge cultures is active listening. And in a way that comes out in the stories that I've already told you. When you engage fully with the speaker, when you show genuine interest in them and what they're saying, and you seek to understand their perspective without any preconceived notions, then you're going to be able to build cultural understanding and bridge between cultures in that way. It's very helpful to practice reflective listening. So you summarize what the other person said so that you can confirm you've understood. That's what I've done with my friend that I talked about before. I'm asking open-ended questions to encourage dialogue. I'm reflecting back what I've already heard. Did I understand this correctly? Or if I heard you right, this is how it turned out, or this is what can happen. And then she gives me feedback to whether I did hear correctly or not. But I'm opening the door to more input from a person of another culture when I ask open-ended questions in that way, because I've been engaging in active listening rather than listening to respond and listening to answer. So if I'm digging for more from them rather than wanting to give back from my own experience, that helps me to bridge the culture. The third thing that helps with cultural bridging is to use clear and simple language. To use language that's easily understood by all the parties. So I avoid jargon, I avoid idioms, I avoid maybe culturally specific references that don't translate too well. Obviously, coming from the UK to the USA, I've had a lot of experience with this. I remember my kids, when we first moved here, would say things to one another, or things would come up in conversation with their friends where one of them would say to the other, "Remember not to say that when we go back to visit Granny." Because my mother would have been totally offended by something that's completely inoffensive here in South Carolina, simply because there's a cultural difference. You can adjust your vocabulary, you can adjust your speaking style to match your audience. That's where the Life Languages understanding can really help you. That profile gives you insights. For instance, if you use concrete examples rather than metaphorical ones, and you use straightforward language in describing what you want to communicate, that will ensure clarity with a different culture. The fourth area, and I'd say this is probably the most vital, is that we need to cultivate empathy and respect. If you're bridging between cultures, there has to be that understanding and respecting of different viewpoints, different experiences, different cultural backgrounds. And if I can acknowledge and validate the feelings and perspectives of others, even if they're different from my own, that can create a safe space for open communication. And so it requires of me that I let go of the sense of I'm right, because if I insist that I'm right and your experience is different, I'm implying that you're wrong. But different is not always wrong. And I need to be careful to make room to hear you and to receive with empathy what it is that's your experience, because your experience is your experience. Obviously, one of the areas where that applies is in the political realm. I know people where within families there are people of vastly different political beliefs, and sadly they get so fixed on their rightness that they lose the ability to disagree respectfully or to hear one another. But when you practice active listening and you cultivate empathy and respect, you'll often find that there's more that can unite us than divide us. And the things that divide us are the things on the extremes, that we can let them sit as differences that we simply put to one side for the sake of connection. We want to create safe spaces, excuse me, for open communication. The fifth area that's really important is non-verbal communication, because non-verbal cues like body language or facial expressions or gestures can vary very significantly across cultures. So pay attention to your own non-verbal signals, but also to how you receive the non-verbal signals from others. For example, it's important to maintain appropriate eye contact and be mindful of personal space, because every culture has a different value for the degree of personal space that they require. And the significance of those non-verbal signals will vary between cultures. That's where doing research is very important. If you know you're going to be communicating cross-culturally, to be sure that you don't inadvertently cause great distress, which will hinder communication by non-verbal signals. And then the sixth thing, maybe I said that empathy was very important, but the sixth thing that's equally important is adaptability. It's something we talk about a lot on this podcast, something we want to cultivate. But being flexible in your communication style, being willing to adjust your approach based on the context, but also based on the feedback you're getting from your audience. So be open to feedback. Maybe go back and listen to episode 9 again about feedback. But be ready to modify your communication if you see that you're not connecting. So if you sense that there's confusion, you need to clarify or rephrase your message so that you can enhance understanding. Or if you sense that there's offense, you need to ask for feedback so that you can adapt your connection to be able to build those bridges rather than causing division. So in those ways, through adaptability, through empathy, and the ways we've listed, I trust that your communication will grow so that you can bridge between different cultures. We encounter different people all the time in daily life, particularly in the business realm, where someone walks in who's from a very different culture than you. And if you can build a connection with them, then you can do business with them more effectively. So your communication mastery really matters to me. And that's why we do what we do. That's why I keep inviting you to come back each week and listen to a new episode of this podcast. But maybe there's somebody that you've thought of, maybe they're of a different culture than you, that would benefit from hearing this podcast. So why don't you pull out your phone right now and text them a link and say, hey, take a listen to this and see if you like it. That will help them, which will also reflect well on you, but it'll help me as well as we gain more listeners and a wider audience for the truths that we're sharing and the ways that we're walking together towards communication mastery. So have a great week, and we'll see you back here next week for more of the Communication Mastery Podcast.